Hello, welcome everybody to tutorial 4 for ESST1006, Human Impacts on the Environment. So we're going to go through this and at the end of it, hopefully you'll have an idea of what I'm expecting from you for this tutorial to be submitted. So the whole idea of this tutorial is around the UNDP's DPSIR Conceptual Framework. So what this conceptual framework is basically a means in which we can use to analyze whether a development or a problem or an issue, an environmental issue, how we can solve it, and whether it is environmentally sensitive or not. So what the DPSIR framework does is it divides up components of an issue into drivers, pressures, states and trends, impacts, and responses. So when we think about an issue, so for instance, water production, what are the drivers behind water production? Obviously, people need water, and so if there are any changes in water production, what are the drivers going to be behind those changes in water production? And the two big ones there I can think of would be population growth of people and also global climate change, which is going to change rainfall patterns. The pressures behind water production would be, again, increasing population, meaning that water is beginning to run short. So we need to find some way of getting more water. And with water running short, how is that going to affect the state of water supplies around the world? Obviously, that's going to start driving it down. And obviously, that is going to be the trend in water supplies. So with an issue like water production, we need to take a look at the state of what water production is like at the moment and what are the current trends in water production. Finally, next we'll take a look at, when we have the states and trends, what are some of the impacts of water production on, or the environmental issue, on the remainder of the environment. So, for instance, we may, in terms of water production, we may be building dams to increase the amount of water production, or we may be creating watersheds which allow harvesting of more water by clearing out all the trees and maybe sealing the surface to allow greater runoff, or we may be constructing dams. What are the impacts of those changes to water production? And then finally, we would take a look at responses. How can we respond to some of the negative environmental impacts that we identify? What can we do? So in the case of impacts like dams, we can reduce the number of dams, or we can create infrastructure around dams which lessen their impact, maybe allowing fish to swim around dams and upstream rather than being caught in the dam, and so on. Okay? So I want you to submit at the end of this tutorial on a sample exam question which goes through and lists a lot of the points which may be the drivers, pressures, states and trends, impacts or responses. And I want you to try and classify each one of those points into one of these different types of things. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at this in a more graphical form, the DPSIR framework. And just to emphasize again why this thing is important, when nations or countries want to work out what environmental impact they are having, and what they can do about it, they can use this framework to understand why the environmental impacts occur and how they can change it. Okay? So the idea is that we start with driving forces. Actually, I think what we're doing is really we're starting with impacts because that's what we're seeing. But we need to work back through from the impacts to what is actually driving the impacts. So the thing that we see is impacts, so that may be lack of water, loss of biodiversity, some sort of environmental degradation. And we'll see that and we'll say, this is no good, we need to try and do something about that. So working back from the impact, we'll take a look at the state of the environment. What is the environment doing at the moment, particularly with respect to the environmental impact that we're looking at, maybe biodiversity loss? What is the state of biodiversity in this particular area or this particular country? And what is the trends in biodiversity loss there? If the biodiversity is high in the country and the biodiversity loss is not that great, okay, so biodiversity isn't being lost, then there really is no problem. So we can go on to another environmental impact. But if biodiversity is trending down, we need to find out why it is trending down. So we look at the pressures on biodiversity loss. Okay? So why is biodiversity declining? What are the pressures on biodiversity which is making it decline? Okay? And that may be land use change. So humans are clearing forests to build farms, like what is happening in the Amazon, and biodiversity is being lost in that way. So why are people clearing land, clearing biodiversity and making it being lost? So to understand that, we need to take a look at the driving forces behind humans clearing land. So why do people start to clear land? What is the driving force? And they're usually socioeconomic, socio-cultural activities, things which are driving human activities. And probably the biggest one there is probably human population growth at the moment. Not only human population growth, but also what increase in GDP and increase in technology which uses more energy, which uses more inputs and therefore needs more land and so on. So driving forces behind the pressures, and to understand, and then once you understand the pressures which are being brought to bear on the state of the environment, biodiversity is declining, then you can understand why we are losing biodiversity that we've observed. So the next step then, to go back to the impact, is what we can do about it. By understanding all of these things, particularly the driving forces, we can think up some sort of response. And that response will quite often involve changing driving forces. So how can we mitigate human needs and such that they reduce the pressures? So these green arrows indicate that our response will change driving forces. But not only driving forces, our response can also reduce pressures while actually allowing the underlying driving force to continue, except that we direct that driving force into a different area, so which is less ruinous to biodiversity. Our responses can address biodiversity loss directly. So we may build more zoos, take biodiversity out, so not solve the pressures, but just save the biodiversity as a short-term goal. We can take a look at impacts we can do restoration or something like that and try and solve the impacts directly. Okay? But if we don't solve the trends and the pressures, this is probably not the most advisable thing to do. Okay? So there you have it. So a way of looking at environmental issues that a country may be going through. Okay? How can we think about it, and how can we solve the problems? So we see the impact, we take a look and see whether the impact is real. So we look at the state of the environment and trends in the resource. We look at why the resource may be declining by looking at the pressures, and then we understand what is forming the pressures by looking at the underlying driving forces, which is quite often human population increase, or maybe even something like global climate change. And then we can look at responses and to those impacts, and those responses must take into account driving forces particularly, but it can also influence all the other different stages in the framework up to the impact. But the main response needs to be addressing these driving forces. If you don't address these driving forces, the pressures will still remain, the trends will still decline, and the impacts will still be real. In the meantime, while we're trying to address these driving forces, short-term actions can be taken to try and prevent that loss of biodiversity. Okay? But unless we address the driving forces, all of these pressures will still remain there. Okay, so this slide just basically gives you some lists of some of the reasons or some of the points in each of the drivers, pressures, states and trends, impacts and responses. Okay, and we can take a look at the drivers here, the pressures here, states and trends here, the impacts here, and then finally the responses here. In the following slides, we can close in on each of those different boxes. First of all, the drivers. So what are the drivers? Mainly material, human, and social capital driving these pressures. And what are they? Mainly demographics, increase in human population size, economic processes, which would be consumption, increasing consumption, greater GDP, greater consumption of inputs and materials. Innovation can act both ways. It can increase pressure and it can actually decrease pressure. One way in which innovation increases pressure, when we take a look at energy supplies, fracking is a technological innovation, and it's put more pressure on global climate change because it's made more carbon in rocks available for transfer into the atmosphere. On the other hand, innovation in terms of renewable energy has meant that there's more scope for using solar energy directly, using solar panels. And battery innovation is making that even more practical for human use. So that will actually take pressure off global climate change in the future. Okay? Distribution pattern, where are these things happening? Cultural, social, political, and institutional processes, how these things are delivering the pressures on the particular resource and the state of that resource. So what are some of the pressures that humans drive? Land use is probably the big one. Clearing natural ecosystems disrupts all those ecosystem services which they provide. Resource extraction is also important, but as people always tell me, Mines and quarries only really take up a very small part of the landscape. So they're much less damaging than, say, agriculture, which takes up large areas of the landscape. Pollution through external inputs, things like fertilizer, chemicals, irrigations, and pollutants and waste from emissions, they are all putting pressure on in the environment. And finally, modification and movement of organisms, invasive species. As humans move species around the world, intentionally or unintentionally, they are going to put pressure on natural ecosystems, both the productivity and the composition of those natural ecosystems. But it's not only humans which cause pressure. You may also have natural processes causing pressure. Things like variations in solar radiation through solar flares and so on, volcanoes, earthquakes. Okay, I'm not going to touch on hurricanes because, well, they are a natural process, but they are becoming influenced more and more by global climate change. Okay, so natural processes can also be a pressure. However, because natural ecosystems have evolved with natural processes, they tend to be less of a problem. They only now are becoming more of a problem because of all of these other pressures causing issues in combination with the natural processes. So the states and trends refer mainly to the natural capital, the atmosphere, the land, water, and biosphere. So this would be, what stocks of water do we have? What stocks of biodiversity do we have? How is the soil? What is the amount of timber that we have in an area? What are the pollination rates for our agricultural crops? How much water are we getting out of these ecosystems? What is the pollution rates? How are the fisheries stocks, and so on? All of these form natural capital, and those are the resources that we use. Okay? The trends would be how those things change over time. Climate change is the big one, and also depletion of the ozone layer, although that problem is more or less solved now. Biodiversity change, mainly biodiversity loss, is one of the big trends, and that is going to cause big problems in the future. Degradation through pollution and depletion of air, water, minerals, and so on, including desertification. Those are trends which are problematic for the state of our natural capital. Okay? And we need to understand them, and for any particular environmental issue, which one of these environmental impacts is causing that trend. Okay? And what is the overall state of our environmental thing, I guess. Okay? All right, so what are the impacts? Because we're looking at humans and a very human-centric sort of framework, we will tend to look at more like, what are the environmental factors determining human well-being? So these are the things that people generally tend to see, and they will take notice of, and they will try and see what the state of that resource is, what are the trends in it, and so on, because they see that it's having some effect on people and how people live their lives. So ecological services such as provisioning services, cultural services, and regulating services. Non-ecosystem natural resources such as hydrocarbons, minerals, and renewable energy. Okay? And some of the things like changes in diseases, pests, radiation, and other hazards. So are these things increasing? So all of these impacts people notice, okay? And they will try and find a way to deal with that by first of all looking at whether it's a real effect in the status and trends, and then the pressures, what is causing those changes. All right. So these changes in these ecosystem services are going to impact on human well-being. So we can take a look at how these changes in ecosystem services change security, access to basic material needs, good health, good social relations. How are these things, which you would recognize as some of the main components of human well-being, how are they being disturbed by these impacts which are disrupting ecosystem services? Okay? These will impact on demographic, social, institutional, and material factors which also influence human well-being. So communities, if ecosystem services are compromised, will impact on demographic, social, and material factors which humans need, which will impact on human well-being. Okay? So really, it's not directly from ecosystem services to changes in human well-being. It's changes in ecosystem services through demographic and social factors into impacts on human well-being. Okay? So take a look at all of these lists of factors. When you have an environmental issue, then you can take a look at these different factors and decide whether they're relevant in your particular case. And what are some of these responses to these impacts? How can we change, or how can we minimize these impacts? Okay? So these responses are formal and informal adaptation to or mitigation of environmental change by altering human activity and development patterns in between the DP and I boxes, and doing things with science and technology, policy, law, and institutions to help try and relieve, first of all, some of the drivers, and then some of the pressures, and then some of the improve some of the states by improving the trends. Okay? So we would try, and the responses would need to try and, most importantly, address the drivers. Okay? It's only by addressing the drivers that you're going to take the pressure off. You can do some short-term things to address the pressures, to try and reduce those pressures on the states and trends, okay, and therefore reduce the impacts, but it's really the drivers that you've got to make up for. Okay. So when you go through that, when you have an issue, you need to take a look at these different components of pressures, drivers, states and trends, impacts, and come up with some sort of responses. So when you're analyzing an environmental issue, what information is relevant in each of those boxes? What information is relevant to, water production in the driver box? What information is relevant to food production in the driver box? Okay? Makes sense? Write them in point form and put them in an appropriate place. So we're going to use this as the exercise that we are going to be submitting. Okay? So we are going to use the sample exam question that we have here. Okay? I'll let you read it, but we're going to take a look at environmental issues connected with food supply and water supply, or food resources and water resources. Okay? So in the context of food resources and water resources, what are the drivers which influence food resources? What are the pressures which are put on the environment, which reduce food resources? What are the states and trends of water resources globally? And what are the impacts that we are feeling now when it comes to food resources? And what responses do we need to try and reduce those impacts? Okay? So we have here some points for answers. And what I want you to do is take a look at each of these bullets. So production, consumption, global climate change, and classify them as either drivers, pressures, states and trends, impacts, or responses. Okay? So for this particular bullet point, production, okay, resources need, all of these things, impact of biofuels on fuel production, impact of increasing meat. What are all of these things? Okay, are they pressures? Are they drivers? Okay, you make your decision. All right. Also, I want you to, for each of these bullets, try and decide how some of these bullets are linked. So is production linked to strategies for ensuring conservation of soil, etc.? Okay? So in the end, you will have your submission. You'll copy all the answer guidelines on the 2 previous slides into a Word document, and you will annotate each bullet point as appropriate with DP SIR and designate which do you think each point is, okay? And that's for each bullet point. So if there is a whole bunch of points under one bullet point, just designate all of those points together as either DP, S, or I. And if you think that there is more than one classification in that bullet point, feel free to put down D and P and S and I if you think that is relevant. Okay? So you're going to annotate each bullet point as appropriate, and you're going to put in brackets whether you feel it's related to another bullet point and state which other bullet point that is. Save that Word document, and you'll submit that through the submission link that I'm putting up on my e-learning. Okay? Great. So if you have any questions on this, please email me. Okay? It's not meant to take you a lot of time, so don't overthink it. All right? Okay. Good. Thanks a lot.